Thank you so much, Hagai, for being here. I'm here with Hagai El-Ad, Executive Director of B'Tselem. Hagai, thank you. I wanted to ask you first, what's new in these elections?
Yeah, so first, thanks for having me. Maybe the first thing that I would say that, like, what happened, I think, shouldn't be normalized, but it also shouldn't be exceptionalized, right? And in that sense, like, maybe I'll begin by saying that what is new is that things that have been postponed but have been there for quite some time have been exposed, but they haven't been created, right? So for instance, like the key fact that there is a solid right-wing majority in the Jewish public in Israel, that is a fact. And in a way, and it's way bigger than, 61 out of 120. This is not a question about like, a fraction of 0.1% of whether, Meretz is above the threshold or below the threshold, right? The fact is, and you can see it like in the results of elections repeatedly in recent years and public opinion polling and everything else, is that there is a solid right-wing majority any day in the Jewish public and in the Knesset. It's true that in recent years, because of the skirmishes around Netanyahu's personal issues of corruption and the trial and so on, have created this weird situation that even though the right-wing majority was there, Netanyahu was having trouble forming, a stable coalition government. But the majority has always been there, and the majority is there now. And by the way, the majority of right-wing parliamentarians is even bigger than Netanyahu's likely coalition, because you have, let's not forget, Israel Beitenu is a right-wing party, part of, the Gantz political party is Gideon Sa'ar, from Likud and so on. So it's way bigger than the 64, 65 seats that are going to be on Netanyahu's current government. People had a time to somehow distance themselves from seeing that fact, but it has been there and it remains there, and it's not going to change anytime soon.
Thank you. Right after the elections happened, right after the results came out, you tweeted that with the rise of the Jewish Power Party, the quiet part of Israel's regime of Jewish supremacy over Palestinians has never been louder. Will you just explain to our audience what you mean by Israel's regime of Jewish supremacy, and what is the quiet part and what is the loud part?
Yeah, so maybe the word quiet wasn't that accurate, because I think that Israeli oppression of Palestinians has never been quiet, right? But perhaps what I really meant was that it's going to become now more blunt and perhaps less sophisticated, and that is both a danger and in a way an opportunity. I'll be happy to try and speak about both. But I mean, first, let's imagine a scenario in which this government is going to shut down Palestinian civil society organizations, right? That would be an extreme step. But let's not pretend that we've forgotten that has begun under the outgoing, reasonable, liberal, digestible government, right? Let's imagine a future in which, the Palestinian communities in Masafer Yatta communities get demolished and people are forcibly transferred, right? It will be horrific, but who laid the groundwork for that? The previous government, right? Ben Gvir's party has this bill to provide blanket impunity to Israeli soldiers that kill Palestinians, right? I mean, it's horrific, but let's not pretend that we don't know that there is de facto impunity, right? It's just done in a more sophisticated way through, this, circus of investigations that go over a very long time. But at the end of the day, that's what the data shows, right? So what I'm trying to point out is that things that already have been at play there's no reason to think that they're going to stop, and they have been at play under governments that were considered to be reasonable or less reasonable, left, right, and center, right? What is potentially different, and this is like in two ways. One is, let's not forget that things can get worse, right? And I'm not thinking about that in lightly, right? Things are terrible, but things can get way worse, and we should remember that. But in that tweet, what I was thinking about was this shift to ways of continuing with the same processes that we're familiar with, but doing it in a fashion that would be faster, cruder, and less sophisticated. And in that sense, just like making away with the decor and with the efforts to make things digestible. And there, I said before, opportunity. So I mean, it could be, but it really depends on us, because I mean, one could assume that once the decor is gone, then the deniability that gives, I don't know, people of good faith in various countries around the world, and elected officials and parliamentarians and foreign governments and so on. So suddenly they would have so much less deniability in continuing to look the other way, or say that this is reasonable, or pretend that their lame statements would actually make a difference in the face of something so blunt. That is a hope, an aspiration, maybe like an assumption, but we should remember that Israel already had in the past, governments that were completely right-wing, and one thought, I'm that person, I'm that one, that kind of clarity would bring about consequences, and there was oceans of clarity, and there were no consequences, right? So I'm not taking that for granted. I think it's incumbent on us to make that point and to come up with these demands. I'm just thinking that as things are more in the open, right, that I would assume that our ability to engage effectively and make demands for action, not in years to come, but yesterday, that we would be able to do that in a fashion will be much more assertive and convincing, and certainly seizing the moral high ground, right? In other words, just like to conclude this long answer, that in an apartheid reality that doesn't begin with a new government, it's been at place for quite some time, but an apartheid reality that makes so much less efforts to hide itself and to pretend that it's a normal democracy, then yeah, we have a fighting chance to expose this reality for what it is, and demand consequences in ways that may become more direct than they were when there was more efforts to serve pretense and decor.
Thank you, Hagai. So then this is your message, the opportunity, the possibilities, the fighting chance you just described. I imagine that's your message for your allies at home and abroad.
Yes, absolutely. I just repeat and say that, like, this has been the demand before, right? No one should have been waiting for the terrible things to come, or for Israeli government that has such a blunt, ultra nationalist, fascist, racist political party in such positions, as is seems to be the obvious outcome of these elections. Like, no one should have waited for any of these things. The reality is sufficiently horrible as it is, and sufficiently clear as it is, and anyone can recount numerous moments in the decades of oppression of Palestinians that would have demanded so much more action, right? I'm thinking about 2014 in Gaza, for instance. Hundreds of dead children. There's so many other terrible moments, right? And of course also they add up. They add up to Israel's ability to completely transform the reality between the river and the sea, as Jewish Israelis have been doing for so many decades. But I think without becoming ahistoric, while acknowledging all that, to also take a look at what has now become even more crystal clear, and do the legwork that we should do to try and push against that in the most effective way that we can, and with a sense of urgency.
Hagai, thank you so much. Thank you for your clarity. Thank you for your clarity and your analysis and your urgent message. I'm grateful. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you very much.
I'm here with Amjad Iraqi. Amjad is an editor and writer at 972 magazine and a policy analyst at the think tank Al-Shabaka. He was previously an advocacy coordinator of the legal center Adallah. Amjad, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with the question of what's new in these elections.
I think one particular thing I would highlight, I know a lot of people are kind of discussing the rise of Kahanism in this election and the return of King Bibi, but I think a very important issue that also needs to be looked at is actually this refragmentation of the Arab political parties in the Knesset. So there are basically four main Arab parties representing Palestinian citizens of Israel. And for about 6 years, these parties had been together in a united slate called the Joint List. And at one point were even the third largest slate in the Knesset with about 15 seats not too long ago. But as I'm sure some of our audiences might know, about a year or so ago, one of the parties, the Islamist Ra'am, led by Mansour Abbas, broke away from the list and sort of offered his party's recommendation for prime minister and to be part of the coalition to any kind of political constellation that emerged. And he ended up becoming a member of the Bennett-Lapid coalition that lasted for about a year. Now, this caused quite a huge schism in Palestinian politics in Israel for many reasons. But what we've seen ever since then is a continuing breakdown and disintegration of the consensus that once bound the Palestinian political parties in Israel, whereby once the idea was that if Palestinian parties were to ally with, for example, Zionist parties in the Knesset, it would usually be with the center left. And here you had Ra'am deciding, kind of also breaking through kind of traditional protocol by saying we would go with someone like Bennett of the far right party, would go with someone like Yair Lapid and this kind of center-right politics. And that has really set the trend for this continuing demise of this consensus. And then what ended up happening just a few weeks ago is that Ra'am, of course, ran by itself, but then Hadash, Ta'al, and Balad, which are like kind of communist, liberal, and nationalist parties, broadly speaking, also split further. There was a lot of infighting. Balad ended up running by itself, and at least so far has still come short under the electoral threshold, while both Ra'am and Hadash Ta'al have now only got 5 seats each. And there's a lot to unpack from all this, but it's the fact that what was once a united front of Palestinian citizens with all its flaws have now kind of returned to this sort of situation where they were about a decade ago, where they have now these kind of minuscule parties that are very divided ideologically, very divided by political clashes, at a time when the far right and the Israeli right and center right are really coalescing around a very hostile political agenda, especially putting Palestinian citizens in the crosshairs. So it's been quite an alarming and dangerous trend that we're seeing.
Thank you, Amjad. So on that hostile political agenda of the far right, it's a hostile political agenda towards Palestinian citizens and a hostile political agenda towards Palestinians overall, from the river to the sea. And so I wanted to ask you, one of the questions, one of the things that people are talking about now is what it looks like to normalize or to not normalize these extremists in the governing coalition and potentially in receiving ministries, Smotrich in a ministry, Ben Gvir in a ministry, others. What are you watching for? What are the tests? What are you keeping your eye out for right now?
I think it's very important to kind of push back against this idea that that Kahanism and that the members of the religious Zionism slate are somehow an anomaly and something that is this kind of exception to the rule. And there are at least two levels to argue as to why this is not the case. One is that you cannot think about the rise of Kahanism or the rise of people like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir without understanding Benjamin Netanyahu. So for the 12 years that he was prime minister, and it seems is returning again, Netanyahu was very much this kind of gatekeeper for an ongoing rightward shift in Israeli politics and providing increasingly right-wing parties and thinkers and leaders, basically offering them the state apparatus and to keep pushing it in that direction. And as that gatekeeper, he actually opened those gates wide open for figures like this. A decade ago, someone like Avigdor Lieberman was once considered very far right. That became followed by Naftali Bennett, who was considered even further right. And now we have people like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir who are even further right. And all this has to be understood with Netanyahu, not just as Netanyahu himself, but the Likud party, which is not only the largest party in the Israeli electorate, but is very much mainstream and now has almost turned itself into this like center-right party as opposed to a very right-wing party. And so this this connection with these other political factions in this on the landscape is very crucial to understand, that you cannot have one without these other constellations in the system. And a second level to understand this is that the ideological underpinnings that guide religious Zionism, that guide the Otzma Yehudit Jewish Power Party, people like Ben-Gvir, is also in many ways a natural continuation of the core ideology of the state and of Zionism in particular. Now, what do I mean by this? In Israel, the inherent underlying philosophy is the concept of a Jewish state. And even though there are different kind of spectrums between the so-called Zionist left and the Zionist right and all these shades in between, it is still underwritten by this idea of Jewish privilege, if not Jewish supremacy and Jewish domination. Whichever version and however kind of pieces of democracy you want to add to it, this is the core, about an ethno-racial superiority that exists. It exists against Palestinians, not only outside the state, but of course Palestinians who even have Israeli citizenship. And that has always been the case throughout Zionism's, through much of political Zionism's vision, and also through the Israeli state's establishment. And so when you really look at what religious Zionism is espousing, it is not a far stretch what they are calling for in terms of the kind of entrenchment of Jewish supremacy, which has always been the case in the state. But just to say, let's make it clearer. Let's not varnish this. Let's not actually have to kind of polish it too much. And you're actually seeing it not just as sort of an abstract concept, but the very fact that someone like Ben-Gvir was able to rally along with Smotrich, 15 seats, making him the largest party in the Knesset. What we've seen in these past few months is that he's able to rally people who are even considering themselves in the center right, precisely because his message resonates, his ideology resonates. He's basically saying, let's just go the whole way through. Don't stop at this midway. And this was very much the same kind of sort of ideological argument that was made by people like Lieberman, by people like Netanyahu, by people like Bennett, and is now just being pushed further by people like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. And so that kind of thinking cannot be separated from the core of the identity. It was almost inevitable that you would get characters like this. It is not an anomaly. It is not some far-flung kind of extreme fringe group. There is an underlying current which allows that party to connect with much of mainstream Israeli society today, and that makes him normalized, that makes that kind of thinking completely normalized. And in that respect, we cannot separate it from that wider context.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate your explanation of this continuum and of how we can be imagining and understanding the emergence of this party and of their power and these extremists as in some ways more of a boiled down essence of what you're describing of this broader identity and broader politics. Thank you for all of that. So what message do you have then for your audience in America, for your audience internationally, but for your audience in the US?
The key thing is, again, to keep the analysis centered on the core of what Israel's state and society is about. it's very easy right now to just focus on Ben Gvir and to focus on religious Zionism and to try to say that as long as we keep them out of government and keep them out of the mainstream, that is what the most important objective. It's certainly a very crucial one, but it is by no means addressing the real issue. And it's not enough just to even talk about Netanyahu himself. The very fact that even you have center-right parties that are allying or that are even espousing many of these kind of right-wing views, whether it's about vis-a-vis Palestinian citizens of Israel or Palestinians in the occupied territories, about the vision of entrenching apartheid in some form or another, or Jewish supremacy or the nation state law, all these have a very broad consensus across the spectrum. So it is crucial to analyze that and to see and to understand that wider context. And the second very crucial issue is to understand that this is not just that our resistance and our movement to this cannot be just as conceived as trying to reform Israel's political Zionism and just trying to maintain a softened version of a Jewish state. The very inherent building blocks of this regime requires supremacy, requires racial dominance, whether you're a citizen or an occupied subject or a refugee. And so in order to contribute to the movement, you need to ally with the camp that is promoting true equality as it should be, that is promoting a true end to the occupation as it should be, that is really pushing for an anti-apartheid movement, an anti-colonial movement. And that camp is led by Palestinians, by Palestinian activists on the ground, by Palestinian thinkers and writers, by Palestinian leaders who are trying to realign our movements, not as sort of an Israeli reformist movement and a Palestinian movement here. No, there needs to be a common aligned movement, and to understand that Palestinians have been articulating the dangers that Zionist ideology can lead to, articulating the dangers of where Israeli politics is leading to, and how impunity inherently empowers these very fascistic trends in the Israeli political spectrum. The idea that the international community needs to be easy on Israel in order to make them make better choices is absolutely proven wrong. The more impunity Israel's enjoyed over the past decade, the more emboldened it feels to go even further and further. So that's a very crucial element to take into account.
Fabulous. Amjad, thank you. Not fabulous, but fabulous. Thank you for your clarity. Thank you for your urgency. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us. I'm so grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.